The courtroom was silent, so silent that the ticking of the old wooden clock hanging on the back wall could be heard over the faint shuffling of papers. A smell of polished oak and dust filled the air, blending with the weight of anticipation, pressing down on every person present. At the center of it all sat Richard Carrington, a man who carried arrogance like others carried cologne. His suit was immaculately tailored, his shoes shined to a mirror's gleam, and his hair perfectly combed back in a way that screamed wealth and control. He leaned back in his chair with the sort of lazy confidence only someone who believed he had already won could display, and in front of him, lying on the heavy mahogany table, were the divorce papers. Across from him sat Evelyn, his wife of 12 years. She was striking, though not in the flashy way Richard preferred to flaunt at parties. Her beauty was quieter, steadier, something that demanded respect more than admiration. She wore a simple black dress, her dark hair pinned neatly back, and her expression remained unreadable. To anyone else, she seemed calm, detached, maybe even resigned. But her eyes held a sharpness that Richard had ignored for years. The judge cleared his throat, his voice steady but weary from years of these proceedings. "Mr. and Mrs. Carrington, today we finalize your divorce. Are both parties ready to proceed?" "Yes, Your Honor," Evelyn said softly. Her voice was calm, almost melodic. Richard chuckled before responding, "More than ready." He didn't. Just say it. He made sure the chuckle echoed, as if mocking the very idea that he could lose anything here, because in Richard's mind, he couldn't. He had the prenup, the ironclad, bulletproof document he had insisted Evelyn sign before they married. A document that guaranteed, no matter what happened, his fortune, his properties, businesses, investments would remain untouched. Evelyn, in Richard's vision of the future, would leave this courtroom with nothing more than the clothes on her back and maybe a modest monthly stipend. The lawyer sitting beside Richard tapped the papers lightly. "Just sign here, Richard," he whispered, though the smug grin on his face mirrored his client's. Richard picked up the pen. He twirled it between his fingers as if savoring the moment. Then, with exaggerated flourish, he pressed the nib to the paper. But before the ink even dried, Richard did something unexpected. He laughed. Not just a small laugh, but a booming, mocking laugh that startled even the stenographer, typing every word of the proceedings. It was the laugh of a man who thought he had cheated fate itself. A laugh that said, "I've won. I always win." Everyone in the courtroom turned to him, puzzled. The judge raised an eyebrow, but Richard kept laughing, his shoulders shaking with amusement. "You'll have to excuse me, Your Honor," Richard said between chuckles, wiping a fake tear from his eye. This is all so unnecessary. We all know how this ends. My lawyer has everything in order. My wife walks away, and He gestured around him at the invisible empire he believed he owned. "I keep what's mine." Evelyn didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even roll her eyes at the man she once loved. She simply sat, hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed firmly on Richard. And for the first time that day, Richard noticed something unusual. She wasn't broken. He had expected tears or anger, or perhaps a bitter, defeated silence. But what he saw instead was something entirely different. Evelyn's calmness unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite understand. Still, he brushed it off. She was just pretending. After all, what could she possibly have up her sleeve? "Proceed," the judge said, slightly irritated by Richard's theatrics. Richard scribbled his signature with a dramatic flourish and pushed the papers forward. His lawyer smiled, smug satisfaction painted across his face. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. Evelyn reached for her pen next. Slowly, carefully, she signed her name across the page. She didn't laugh. She didn't sigh. She didn't even blink. She simply handed the papers back to the clerk, her expression unreadable. The room was quiet again, but the silence wasn't the same as before. This silence felt charged. The judge shuffled the papers, his brow furrowing slightly as he flipped to the last page. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the attached documents. His eyes narrowed. He turned back a page, then forward again. His lips pressed into a thin line. Richard, noticing this, smirked. "Something wrong, Your Honor?" he asked, his tone dripping with arrogance. The judge didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached for another folder, the one containing the prenup agreement. He held it in his hands, his eyes darting between signatures, stamps, and dates. The courtroom waited. Richard leaned back, his smirk widening. "That's the prenup, Judge. Signed and sealed. My wife gets nothing. As I said, this is just a formality." But the judge didn't look convinced. He leaned in closer, holding the prenup up to the light. A strange expression flickered across his face. Confusion, maybe even suspicion. Evelyn sat still, her hands folded neatly. But for the briefest second, a small, almost invisible smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Richard didn't notice. He was too busy enjoying his own performance. He chuckled again, shaking his head. "Honestly, I should have brought champagne. This is a celebration." The judge finally set the documents down and looked at Richard, his voice firm but edged, with something new, something Richard had never heard before in a courtroom. Doubt. "Mr. Carrington, this prenuptial agreement, something doesn't look right." The room fell into absolute silence, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Richard's smirk faltered, just for a second, before he forced it back into place. "Excuse me?" The judge tapped the paper with his pen. "This prenup, I'll need to review its validity." And in that moment, Evelyn's calm, unreadable stare became something else entirely. It became the look of someone who had been waiting, patiently, silently, purposefully, for this very moment. Richard laughed again, louder this time, though there was a slight crack in his voice. "Judge, with all due respect, that prenup has been ironclad for over a decade. My lawyers—" But the judge cut him off. "We'll see about that." And just like that, Richard's laughter began to echo differently in the courtroom, not as the sound of victory, but as the first sign of a man who didn't realize the ground beneath him was already crumbling. Their home was a sprawling estate on the edge of the city, a mansion with marble floors, chandeliers dripping with crystal, and walls lined with art worth more than most people's entire lives. Outsiders saw wealth. They saw perfection. They saw a couple who had it all. But inside those walls, cracks ran deeper than the foundations. At the long dining table, Richard would sit at the head, swirling wine in his glass, smirking as though the entire world were a stage for him to perform on. Evelyn would sit across, often in silence, pushing food around her plate. "Do you know what your problem is, Evelyn?" Richard said once, his voice laced with mockery. "You don't appreciate what you have. Most women would kill for this. Life. For me." He laughed as though his words were a joke, but Evelyn didn't laugh. She rarely did anymore. Instead, she remembered the night, 12 years ago, when Richard had first placed that prenup before her. They had been young then. She still believed in love, in fairy tales, in promises. He had been charming, persuasive, intoxicating in his confidence. When he slid that document across the table, explaining it was just business, just protection, she hesitated. But love can blind, and so she signed. At the time, it seemed harmless. At the time, she thought it was a gesture of trust. At the time, she didn't know how much it would later cost her, or so Richard thought. Richard's empire over the years, Richard built his empire not just on money, but on arrogance. He flaunted his success, Lavish parties in the mansion, expensive cars lined up in the driveway, business deals sealed with cigars and laughter. People respected him, feared him, envied him. But Evelyn saw something they didn't. Behind the bravado, behind the laughter, was a man who needed control like others needed air. And control, for Richard, meant making sure Evelyn was trapped. Every argument ended the same way. "If you ever try to leave," Richard would sneer, leaning close enough for his voice to sting, "you'll walk away with nothing. Remember the prenup. Remember, Evelyn, you are replaceable." And then he would laugh. That laugh became a weapon sharper than any knife. Evelyn's silence. But what Richard never understood was Evelyn's silence. He thought it was weakness, submission, defeat. In truth, it was calculation. Evelyn had grown. Quiet, yes. She endured his arrogance, his dismissals, his affairs whispered about at charity galas. She endured it all, but not because she was powerless. She endured because she was waiting, because Evelyn knew something Richard didn't. The night of the missing filet was 2 years ago, during one of Richard's drunken parties, that Evelyn stumbled upon something. She had retreated to his office, an oak-paneled room he guarded fiercely, to escape the noise. There, among scattered contracts and open bottles of scotch, she found a folder with her name on it, the prenup. She opened it, her heart pounding. The signatures were there, the stamps, the dates, but something was off. One of the notary stamps looked incomplete. The official seal was missing from the filing copy. Her hands shook as she placed it back. Richard had always boasted the prenup was airtight, but what if it wasn't? She didn't confront him. She didn't breathe a word. She simply filed that discovery away in her mind, as quietly as she had endured his cruelty all these years. From that night on, Evelyn played a dangerous game. She smiled when he expected it. She nodded when he demanded it. She became invisible, blending into the background of his empire. But inside, she was building her own kind of strength. Back to the courtroom. And now, years later, she sat across from him in the courtroom, watching him laugh as though the world still belonged to him, watching him gloat about the prenup. But she knew. She had always known. And as the judge leaned closer to the papers, his brow furrowed, Evelyn allowed herself the smallest flicker of a smile. Richard's arrogance peaks. Richard, of course, couldn't see it. He was too caught up in his performance, too busy playing the part of the untouchable man. "Your Honor," he said, leaning back with mock relaxation, "you'll see everything is in order. I made sure of it. Evelyn knows the deal. She knew it the day she signed. She can put on her little act of calm dignity all she wants, but in the end," he let out another laugh, "in the end, she walks away with nothing." The courtroom murmured. Lawyers exchanged glances. And Evelyn just kept her eyes on Richard, her calmness, now glowing like armor. The judge's concern. The judge's voice broke the tension. "This document, it may not have been filed with the state properly." Richard froze, the smirk slipping just slightly. His lawyer leaned in, whispering frantically, flipping through the papers again. The room thickened with suspense. And Evelyn, still silent, remembered every night Richard had laughed at her, every time he had dismissed her, every time he told her she was powerless. Now, she thought, let's see who's powerless. The air in the courtroom had changed. What began as Richard's stage for victory was slowly morphing into something else, something heavier, sharper, and far more dangerous. The judge's fingers tapped the prenup papers, his eyes darting across. The signatures again and again. Richard's lawyer whispered frantically in his ear, but for once, Richard didn't laugh. He forced a smirk, but even that felt strained, painted on. "Your Honor," his lawyer began nervously, "I assure you this agreement is valid. It was signed, witnessed, and—" The judge raised a hand, silencing him. Signed? Yes. Witnessed? Possibly. But filed? He leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses. This agreement was never properly filed with the state registrar. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like a sudden wave. Richard's eyes widened. That's ridiculous, he barked, his voice cracking. We've had this prenup for 12 years. Perhaps, the judge said calmly. But without proper filing, it carries no legal weight. Richard's laugh returned, but it was different now, hollow, desperate. You can't be serious. This is absurd. My lawyer, he filed it. The lawyer looked pale, shuffling through documents as though the missing stamp might magically appear. But it didn't. And Evelyn simply sat there, silent, composed. For the first time in years, Richard turned fully toward her, his eyes narrowing. You knew! His voice was low, dangerous. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, her calm gaze unshaken. I suspected. The judge cleared his throat, his voice echoing like a gavel strike. Mr. Carrington, without this agreement, Mrs. Carrington is entitled to half of all marital assets under state law. Half. The words slammed into Richard like a blow. His empire, his mansion, his businesses, his wealth, sliced in half with a single sentence. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously. Even the stenographer's fingers seemed to race faster. Richard stood abruptly, his chair screeching across the floor. This is insane. You can't do this. To me, do you know who I am? The judge's gaze was unflinching. I know exactly who you are, Mr. Carrington, and in this courtroom, you are a man bound by the law. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice steady but carrying years of quiet strength. You always laughed at me, Richard, laughed because you thought I was powerless. But you forgot something important. Richard glared at her, his face red, veins bulging at his temple. And what's that? She leaned forward slightly, her words cutting sharper than any knife. The law doesn't bend for arrogance. For the first time in his life, Richard had no laughter left. The decision. The judge raised his gavel. This court finds the prenuptial agreement invalid. Assets will be divided equally. Mrs. Carrington, you are entitled to half. The gavel struck. Bang! Richard sank back into his chair as though the world had collapsed beneath him. His lawyer buried his face in his hands. The man who had walked in laughing now sat in stunned silence, the sound of his defeat echoing louder than any laughter he had ever given. Evelyn stood, her posture graceful, almost regal. She didn't gloat. She didn't mock. She simply gathered her things, nodded respectfully to the judge, and turned toward the door. But just before she left, she glanced back at Richard one last time. And for the first time in years, it was she who allowed herself a small laugh. Not cruel, not arrogant, just a quiet, triumphant laugh. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as Evelyn walked out, free, the aftermath ass. The doors closed behind her. Richard's voice cracked through the silence. This isn't over, he shouted, though even he didn't believe it anymore. Because deep down, he knew. It was over. Evelyn had won. Final words. And so the man who once laughed at the thought of losing sat broken by the very thing he thought would protect him, while the woman he underestimated all along left with her dignity, her strength, and half of everything he thought untouchable. The last laugh had never truly been his.